All right, so let's talk about debt because I don't think anyone takes this debt problem seriously enough. The combined national debt of the US, the UK, the EU, and Japan now sits at roughly $70 trillion. But the worst part is that number is costing you and I thousands of dollars every year because it's devalued the money in our bank accounts by 30% or so for the last 15 years. And what should scare you, really, is that this number is trending up. It's getting worse every year, and it's accelerating, which is obviously not good. Especially when you consider that the new Federal Reserve Chairman, Kevin Warsh, said, and I quote, "We need a new Treasury-Fed Accord like we did in 1951, because that is one of the most frightening and frankly insane things I've heard any Fed chairman say publicly. But we'll come back to that quote because first we need to give it some context. We need to talk about the rest of the picture. Because, even if you're not in the US, this hits all of us, and it's a very serious situation. And it all starts with tax. I mean, we all hate tax. They charge us too much tax, but there's a hidden tax that nobody talks about, and most people don't even realize they pay. That tax is inflation. Inflation is the most insidious tax we pay, and it's purely because the countries we live in cannot control their spending. They rack up massive amounts of debts, then they charge us inflation to cover it. And the US is paying, by the way, this is a crazy number, the US is paying over $1 trillion a year in interest on its debt alone. 1 trillion. That is more than the US spends on defense, and it's roughly 19 cents for every tax dollar that an American pays. That just goes towards paying off the debt. In the UK, that figure is closer to 110 billion pounds. In Germany and the rest of the EU, it's comparable in scale. It's a few hundred billion euros. In Japan, the interest bill, that's a different monster, really. In Japan, the interest bill is the foundation on which the entire fiscal system for that country is built on. We'll get to that in a few moments. So to understand where this ends, we need to look at the last time a seriously developed country nearly defaulted. And it wasn't really that long ago. It was only 50 years ago. I mean, kind of long. But anyway, October 1976, Britain was a major industrial economy in serious way. It was still a first world... It's still a first world country now. It was still a major power is what I was trying to say, but I was close really because barely hanging on. Anyway, so it was still a major power. The pound had collapsed against the dollar across that year, and the country was within weeks of being unable to pay its bills. The Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Dennis Healey, he was on his way to an airport for an international conference, but this situation got so serious that he had to turn around while he was on his way, drive back to Downing Street, and he had to make a phone call. And this was one of the most embarrassing phone calls ever made by a political figure. He had to make a phone call and he had to borrow nearly $4 billion from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It was the largest loan the IMF had ever made, and he needed that loan to save the UK. It was about to default. Now, $4 billion in 76 was a lot of money. These days, it's not. But it saved the country just by the skin of its teeth. And every major government in the developed world watched this happen, and they agreed that they would never let it happen to them. And that's why we're in the situation we are now. It's all thanks to the UK. The system that they've built, that the Western world has built over the last 50 years since then, is the machine that we're going to walk through, and it's going to explain all of this. So how does a country go into debt? We need to talk about that in the first place. The same way a person does, really, with just one extra trick. They have an extra little trick that they can use. We'll talk about that. First, let's break down government debt. So governments spend more money than they make, and in my opinion, this is because they're fiscally irresponsible. Many would disagree with my opinion on this, but I feel I'm right on this one. But when you want to spend more money than you have, what do? You borrow money, right? How does a government borrow money? They issue bonds. You buy the bonds, they promise to pay you back with interest yearly, and then at the time the bond matures, they give you back the principal after a number of years. These years can range anywhere between 1 to 50 years, just depending on the country and how they structure their bonds. Generally, the longer bonds last, the longer they last till maturity, the more interest you get. This isn't a set in stone rule, but it's roughly how it works. So who buys these bonds? You do. Foreign governments do. Pension funds do, which is usually how you purchase them through your pension fund. Other countries' central banks buy them too. Pretty much everyone holds US bonds, and most countries hold each other's bonds to an extent. But here's the trick that I talked about. You know that trick that they use? A country's own central bank can buy its own country's bonds. which is nuts. Because when that happens, the government has effectively borrowed money from itself. And then it has to pay interest to itself. It's like if you printed your own credit card, went on a spending spree, and now you owe yourself a bunch of money and you pay interest to yourself. It sounds kind of broken because it kind of is broken. And it's a bit of a cheat code for governments. Actually, it's the cheat code that runs the entire economy of pretty much all of our countries to an extent. But remember, printing money to yourself, or printing money and borrowing it yourself, it means that you have to pay yourself interest, which means you have to print more money. Just remember that, printing money. Lock the printing money into your head, because we'll talk about that again in a second. Now, look, I said at the start that the combined debt of the US, the UK, the EU, and Japan is around $70 trillion. That's roughly 70K per person living in those nations. It's an obscene amount of money. Can this debt be repaid is the question. Well, there's only really 4 ways a country gets out of debt this big. Let's break them down. Option 1, you outgrow the debt. That means a country grows its economy so fast that the debt becomes tiny in comparison. This is how the US escaped the Second World War debt pile that they had in the 50s. It is, unfortunately, right now, mathematically impossible. The US economy grows at around 2% a year, and the interest bill alone, like I said, is $1 trillion and growing every quarter. And the UK, for example, they grow even more slowly. Germany has been in or near a technical recession for the last 2 years. Japan has been stuck in low single-digit growth for like 30 years. You can't outgrow debt that compounds faster than your economy does. That's the problem. And the US is hoping that AI just like magically solves this problem. But AI can't even tell us how many R's in the word strawberry. So I think we might be screwed. Also, since when is hope a strategy? Like, when is hope a strategy? You have to have an actual bloody plan, not just rely on hope. Anyway, the size of the leverage is now so large that even a generational productivity miracle would only buy a little bit of extra time. So option two is you default. A country simply refuses to pay what it owes. The 1976 UK story we just walked through is what happens just before a country default. Nobody does it voluntarily. The political and the economic cost is just unthinkable. A US default, by the way, would freeze the global financial system overnight. It would be a disaster the likes of which we've never seen before. A UK or German default would probably do the same to Europe. A Japanese default would unravel half of Asia in a week, cause a lot of problems globally too. So you have to understand how deep these countries are into bonds. Japan holds roughly $1.2 trillion of US bonds. The UK has about $1 trillion. If the US defaults, it's an absolute disaster for both these countries. So this is the option that exists on paper that never really gets picked because it just causes too much chaos. Although who knows, maybe this time we might need to. Anyway, option 3 is austerity. Cut spending, cut services, cut benefits, cut payrolls, cut investment, cut everything, just cut. Greece tried this, they tried this seriously. Between 2010 and 2018, 8 years of cuts, unemployment hit a peak of 28%, and the political cost destroyed the government, right? The country went through 5 prime ministers in 4 years, a record that the UK was desperately trying to beat, but they are failing because they've only managed to go through 5 in 5 years. The UK even fails at serious face. Okay, look at the political climate in every country we're talking about right now. Look at the protests, look at the rise of political fringes, look at how thin the patience has already become with the government. We're already drowning in inflation. The cost of food has gone up like, people say 30%, but to me it feels more like 50 to 100%. Energy has doubled. People are suffering already. You cannot tell citizens already squeezed by inflation that they have to absorb yet another decade of pain because politicians lost control of spending, because they were irresponsible. And why is there so much why is their incompetence rather our problem anyway? That's my question. Why should we pay for their incompetence? I guess shit rolls downhill like it always does. Anyway, whatever. Before I get angry, let's speak about option 4, because austerity I don't think is going to happen because people are pissed off enough already that austerity is just going to tip things over. So option 4 is inflate it away. You quietly debase the currency so that the debt, which is fixed in dollars or pounds or euros or yen, becomes smaller in real terms, which is what many, including me, believe Kevin Warsh and Trump plan to do. Oh, and obviously the UK, the EU, and Japan, etc., will follow suit. We're going to come back to Warsh's plan in a second, but let's break down how inflating debt away works first. It's kind of a cycle, right? The government spends too much money, so they issue bonds. That's how they borrow money. We talked about that. But now they owe a lot of interest. So they print money to pay off the interest. This is inflation. It devalues the currency. Combine devaluation with incompetence, and then you need to borrow even more next year, and then it just becomes a cycle, which makes the interest repayments higher, which means they have to print more money. This is basically the debt cycle. It's a trimmed down basic version of the debt cycle. Now, you might be thinking, surely the central banks won't allow this. They have inflation targets. They have independence. They have legal mandates. I'm sorry, if you think that. Anyway, watch what's already happening across the 4 countries we've already started with. I mean, Japan first, because Japan is in the end state. The Bank of Japan now owns roughly half of all Japanese government bonds in existence. When a central bank owns half of its own country's debt, the debt is not really debt anymore in any meaningful sense of the word. It's an accounting entry between 2 parts of the same government. They are literally paying themselves, like, I think it's 45 billion per year of interest to service their own debt. The world is going insane, really. The interest the Treasury pays on those bonds goes to the central bank, and then the central bank sends most of it back to the Treasury. Japan has been running this experiment for 30 years and it's not working really well, which is why $1 buys 159 yen. That's what currency debasement looks like. The UK is next, because the UK shows what's happening when politicians are exposed to heavy doses of lead in their formative years. September 2022, all right, I'm going to heat it up. I'm just going to bring it down for a sec. So September of 2022, the Truss government announced unfunded tax cuts on a Friday afternoon. The gilt market revolted within hours. Gilts are what the UK calls bonds because it likes to be different, whatever. UK pension funds, which were leveraged into the gilt market, the bond market, nearly collapsed across the following week. It was an absolute disaster. The Bank of England had to step in with tens of billions in emergency intervention just to stop the unwind. So the lesson everyone took from that, because the whole world takes lessons from the UK's screw-ups. That's usually how this thing works. The lesson everyone took from that was not that you cannot run large deficits. The lesson was that you have to do it more carefully, with the central bank standing ready to catch the bond market when it stumbles. So Germany's next, because Germany shows us that even the disciplined ones eventually have to fold in this reality that we've built. For 2 decades, Germany held a constitutional debt brake. It was the most fiscally disciplined large economy in the world. It was brilliant, actually. A debt brake is exactly what it sounds like. They pump the brakes on debt if it gets too high. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but, roughly. In March of 2025, the Bundestag, which is, the political thing, voted a 2/3 majority to suspend it, right? 500 billion in new debt for infrastructure, defense spending above 1% of GDP. It got exempted from the brake entirely. So Germany built its national identity around fiscal discipline. It made it the strongest economy in Europe, and then it just decided to cancel it. The new chancellor cited Ukraine and the breakdown of the US-EU relationship as the main reason. But the reasons matter less than the precedent that it sets. Once you breach a constitutional debt brake, it's gone. It's over, right? And finally, the US, with a new Fed chair, just told us in public that the accord that has kept inflation roughly under control since 1951 is at odds with recent practice. And by the way, I know saying that inflation has been roughly under control since 1951 sounds like a bit of a joke, because it's not really that under control. But compared to the supposed plan that they want to implement now, we'll remember the last 70 years pretty fondly, which finally brings us back to Kevin Warsh. He said, well, it'll pop up on screen, read it. I don't want to read it again because I don't want to get any dumber than I already am. Now, you need to understand what the 1951 Accord actually was. After the Second World War, the US Treasury used the Federal Reserve as a financing arm. The Fed was told to hold down bond yields so the cost of paying for the war debt stayed low. It worked for a while, but by the late 1940s, it caused inflation to spike to the double digits. The 1951 Accord signed under Truman ended this practice. It gave the Fed independence to set interest rates without being told to support Treasury borrowing. It's the foundation that kept inflation roughly under control for the next 70 years. Every credible economist in the world will tell you this. Warsh is proposing to revisit that exact agreement. He's He's selling it as a return to discipline, as a way to shrink the Fed's bloated balance sheet, as the responsible thing to do. And he might be sincere with this, but I doubt it. I mean, the guy's a banker worth hundreds of millions, so he's probably not being sincere. I mean, what are the odds? Since when has a banker been honest anyway? But look, even if he is, it doesn't matter. The accord he's proposing would formally coordinate Fed asset purchases with how the Treasury issues debt. So Deutsche Bank's analysis of a Warsh-led Fed says that the short-term Treasury bills could rise from under 5% of the Fed's holdings to 55%. So they're going to be buying more and more short-term Treasuries, which is good for the Treasury because that's the kind of bills they want to issue. So Warsh is selling this as fiscal discipline, but the machinery being built is actually the opposite. Coordinated debt issuance, cheaper short-term funding, a bias towards rate cuts. This is precisely what a president who wants to finance large deficits cheaply and inflate away the existing debt pile would want to build first. And look, you don't have to take this from me, by the way. I'm just a guy on YouTube. Don't listen to me. 6 former Federal Reserve officials publicly raised concerns about Warsh's Accord comments in a CNBC piece earlier this month. It was an interesting piece. I'll link it below if I remember. So Jeffrey Lacker, a former Richmond Fed president and a known hawk, said he said it in the cleanest way possible. An accord could be fine if it kept the Fed focused on monetary policy. But then he said he could also picture a less constructive version where the Treasury uses the Fed's balance sheet to bypass Congress. If you give a president, and I don't care who the president is, this isn't an opinion on Trump or anyone really, it doesn't matter who the president is, if you give a president a way to bypass Congress and control the Fed, they will do it. That experiment has been run many times throughout history. One of the more recent ones is Turkey. Turkey's president, Erdogan, I can never say his name, fired 3 central bank governors between 2019 and 2021 for refusing to cut rates while inflation was rising. By late 2022, Turkish inflation, it peaked at over, I think it was 85%. Argentina, decades of political pressure on the central bank produced cycle after cycle of hyperinflation. The peso, it lost over 99% of its value against the dollar in 20 years. Now, I can already hear the comments. The US is different. It prints the world's reserve currency, so this can't happen in the US. Wrong. Reserve status doesn't make you somehow immune to all this. It just buys you extra time. And don't forget, the US had already run this exact experiment once in the 1940s. The Fed was the Treasury's money printer and inflation hit double digits, so it's happened before. That mess is the entire reason the 1951 Accord exists, and now they want to repeal it, essentially. Warsh just wants to tear it up. Look, the thing is, a sitting president or prime minister who wants to win a vote, they do that by lowering interest rates and flooding the market with money because short term, it feels good. It feels good to us. It makes debt cheaper to service, the economy feels stronger, and the stock market go up, which we all love. But long term, it leads to hyperinflation. But that's a problem later. That's a problem for the next guy. Which is how politics works in the West anyway. Now, actually, it's our problem. It's not a problem for the next guy. It's our problem because our dollars, our pounds, our euros, our yen, they sit in the bank and they lose value, just like the yen did. $1 is worth 159 yen. If that happens to the dollars in your bank account, then one loaf of bread all of a sudden costs $300. Anyway, Warsh's Accord is, in my opinion, a Trojan horse. The horse looks like discipline. What's inside is the structural capacity for the Fed to become the buyer of last resort for whatever the Treasury wants to issue. And the worst part of all this is people will tell you that a country has to run on debt, that it's vital. But a few countries have shown us that none of this is inevitable. Switzerland has a national debt under 1/3 of GDP and runs a surplus in most years. Norway has built a sovereign wealth fund worth more than its entire national debt. It's not that fiscal discipline is impossible. It's that none of the countries we talked about today have any intention of trying it. So this is where we are. $70 trillion in debt that cannot be repaid by growth or default or austerity. A new Fed chair quietly proposing the legal framework that lets the printer go to work dressed up as a return to discipline. Anyway, if you want to know more about this, follow me on Substack. It's my free newsletter. There's a link below. I'll see you in the next one.